Was plus Dutch for cheers.
Cool. So, hello everyone. Welcome to Beyond Binary Thinking. We are very lucky to be joined today by Graham Lynch. He's the founder of Communications Day, and he's written and edited various publications in the telecommunications sector. So, when I saw that Australia was having some issues, not only with their social media companies, but there was the interaction of traditional media and then the politics surrounding that, I thought there would be no greater guest to have on board. So, Graham, thank you very much for joining us today.
I'm very pleased to be here and hope you're both well.
Yeah, we are. Thank
Yeah,
you.
we are. Thank you.
Are you currently able to look at news on the Facebook news feed in Australia?
No, we cannot, and at all. And I found a way to hack it. I found
There
two ways
always
to hack it.
is.
Actually, I found two ways to hack it, and they removed one of the ways after I posted about it. You could do a shortened URL. They prevented that. Now you can do a Twitter link if you can be bothered. So no, we cannot see news on Facebook in Australia. Our world has not ended. I hasten to add that the sun came up this morning and the birds were still tweeting during the day, so everything's all good here.
You wouldn't have thought it if you'd have seen some of the panic that was going on. Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. My favorite is Peter Thiel's book. So early on, and Peter Thiel famously brought down Gawker. I don't know if you remember that story.
Okay.
So familiar with Peter Thiel, Marang?
Yep.
I think for the benefit of our viewers and listeners, you should retell the story, Chris.
Yeah, so Peter Thiel, I think, had a few articles in Gawker, which was an early days tabloid gossip column, speculating about his homosexuality. He wasn't particularly happy with that. And then when he found that they'd written something about Hulk Hogan, his lawyers said this is the perfect case to sue them into oblivion, which is exactly what he did. Now, he wrote a few years ago in his book, 0 to 1, that all of these tech giants will, when they're approaching investors, say that they are all things to all men. But when they approach the government, they say, oh, but we are just little. And that was Facebook's approach here. They were like, but we're just making recommendations for nice news articles that people may wish to read. And it's not part of our business model at all, even though it's called the newsfeed, literally.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, when Tim Berners-Lee invented the concepts behind the World Wide Web, I don't think he envisaged that companies benefiting from that would have market capitalizations of $1 trillion, which of course changes the whole dynamic of everything, and particularly in terms of behavior, because that's a hell of a lot of market cap at a very, very peak share price you have to sustain, which encourages you to do all sorts of potentially bad things. And that's what we're seeing.
I mean, exponential growth, right, is the name of the game. That's what the shareholders want.
Yeah. So the principle that everything should link to everything for free on the net sort of perhaps ceases to apply when two companies control 81% of all the advertising revenues on the net, and then it's looked at in a different way, and that's exactly what's been happening.
It's always been the necessary dance with the devil. I remember the Oatmeals cartoons showing that, it's a great way to get your fans engaged, and then you invite them in, and then at a certain point, Facebook's like, oh, you'd like to show that post to your fans? You'll have to now pay to play, right? Pay to boost
Correct. That actually, that's a very, very good example of how, in some respects, Facebook in particular have corrupted the original ideals of the web. Just build a community, and then we're going to charge you a ticket every time you want to talk to them. So, yeah, that's a great example.
Yeah. So Google played it different. Google, like as they do with the EU when they're having big troubles, just go, okay, how many billion to settle this, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, look, it's interesting. It might be a good idea if I take you through a little bit of history as to how this happened, because didn't just happen last week. This is a 3-year process that's led to this point. And of course, as both of you, I'm sure, are very, very familiar with how media cycles work and how the whole lot of the iceberg remains under the water quite often when these stories are told.
It takes years for a story to become an overnight sensation, sure.
Yeah, so we have a competition regulatory body in Australia called the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. It's not really analogous to anything you have in Europe or indeed even in North America. It's an independent commission. The only control the government really has over it is to appoint its chairman once every 5 years. The current chairman was appointed by a former government that is no longer in government. So he's not a hack working for the prime minister. You know, he's not a lackey doing what he's told by a politician. He has his own mind. And about 3 years ago, they decided to do an inquiry into digital platforms. And they do inquiries into everything all the time: ports, trains, you know, even esoteric things like online mortgages and all sorts of things. So they look at everything all the time. So they decided to look at digital platforms. And what they found, and this is the specific finding that triggered this, was that in Australia, Facebook and Google get 81 cents out of every dollar spent on online advertising. And from a point of view of a competition regulator, they look at that and they think of one word: concentration. We've got to have a look at this a little bit closer. So kind of look, very long story short, they went through various inquiries and interim reports and submission processes and so on. And kind of very long story short, they basically got to the point where they looked at it as from a pure theoretical competition point of view, which is Google and Facebook are in a competition for digital advertising with newspapers, online radio stations, online TV, and so on and so on. But they also control the links, what they term news referral services, which is the argument here, the links that go to these platforms. So you're in competition, you're competing for dollars, but you also have a control over the traffic that goes to the websites of newspapers, radio stations, and so on and so on. So you have a control going one way, or what they call a kind of unequal market power is how they use it, compared to going the other way, where for all his power, Rupert Murdoch does not really control the traffic going to Google or Facebook. He has no influence over that. So they looked at it from a purely competition point of view. And they said, we see a problem here. Now, this has been defined, this has been misreported as Google and Facebook are going to start to have to pay for clicks. That's not actually what it is. What it is that, hey, Google, Facebook, we think you have an unreasonable degree of market power over your competitors in digital advertising. We also think that we've made an observation that those competitors do more for their society than you do. They employ journalists, they create content.
They pay tax.
They actually pay tax. Exactly. When you buy a Facebook ad in Australia, it gets billed in Ireland. When you buy a Google ad in Australia, it gets billed in Singapore. Okay. I have my bank calling me up all the time saying, why are you getting all these transactions from Ireland? I was like, take a look at who it is. So they said, well, okay, not only do you have an unreasonable degree of market power in digital advertising, but you're also eroding their ability to do public interest things. So what we think you should do is talk to each other in good faith about how you can help each other. And if you don't do that, we're going to put a law in that makes you talk to each other. And if you can't agree on something, we'll put an independent arbitrator in who will actually look at the flow of value both ways. This is what has really been not reported about this. The arbitrator has a specific bunch of things they're supposed to look at. And one of them is how much value goes both ways. Conceivably, it could end up with newspapers paying Facebook.
Which Facebook tried to argue should happen, right? Interestingly.
Indeed. But Facebook is acting as if they don't think that will happen because they don't seem to have any confidence that they would win or do well in an arbitration. They seem to think it's all stacked against them. So that's the sum of it. So what happened was that Google, which in Australia is about 3 or 4 times the size of Facebook. So Google makes about, it's hard to tell because the revenues keep booked around the world. From what we can find out, they make maybe around $4 to $5 billion in Australian dollars in revenue a year. I think about half that for pounds in terms of exchange rate. And Facebook is a bit smaller. They're about $1 billion to $2 billion in revenue, depending on how it's measured. So what happened was that Google was the one that got very, very bolshy a few weeks back when this law entered the parliament. And they said, we'll withdraw the search engine. And at the same time they did that, they went into negotiations with all the publishers, not just Rupert Murdoch, but all of them, and has now signed deals with pretty much all of them. Facebook hung back, looking like they were just going to do whatever Google did. They saw that Google had signed all these deals. Saw that Google signed all these deals, and like, oh no, Google's gone and actually paid some money. This is not what we want. And so Facebook basically decided to go on strike and refused to. Now, what happened was they didn't actually have a list of publications they wanted to ban. They had an algorithm which basically said if it smells like news, it looks like news, it has some degree of currency, block it. So there goes things like domestic violence, advice pages, suicide prevention groups, charities for amputees, COVID-19 health information, even the weather forecast, because the weather forecast is news. It all got blocked. And look, Facebook had a humiliating public relations defeat in Australia. I know a heap of people in Australia who are active Facebook advertisers who have said, we're not going to advertise again. The very conspicuous one is the Australian government, which used to spend tens of millions of dollars advertising on Facebook about things like wear a mask when you're on public transport. And they said, no, you're not going to get any more of our money now. So no matter what happens, Facebook has taken a big hit here in terms of reputation. It was rated about 2 weeks ago, a survey company here called Roy Morgan did a survey of the most trusted and distrusted brands in Australia. And Facebook was one of the most distrusted, in company with Google and, ironically enough, Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation. So three of the major protagonists here are in the top 10 most hated companies in Australia.
Yeah,
so,
and that's hilarious. When you're up against Rupert Murdoch and seen as the bad guy, that's impressive.
Exactly, that's what's happened. Yeah. Well, we can get on. We can talk about that later. Actually, I just want to illustrate all that because this is not Rupert Murdoch giving Scott Morrison a phone call saying "Do my bidding." Like
that's how it's been published. I have read that version.
Yeah, it was a long process to get here, and it was actually through, as I say, an application of theoretical competition law that led us to this point. And the fact that Rupert Murdoch is a beneficiary is not the reason it happened. It's just
this is often the problem
controversial effect.
Yeah, it's often the problem with billionaires, though, right? It's like when you end up talking about Bill Gates and somehow he'll profit from this. You're like, but once you're a billionaire, you're kind of tied up in everything.
Yeah, right? you'll profit anyway.
Anyway,
that's right. Yeah. So anyway, I interrupted you, and I've been
no, it's perfect. I think the reason why this story just captures the zeitgeist perfectly is because all other countries are watching, right? And there's this big problem when corporations become bigger than governments and no one's really sure how to handle it. And Australia seems to have been the first to have, I don't know, not lost in a game of chicken with these tech giants and been like, all right, let's have some awkward conversations then.
I'll tell you where it came from, and it came from not where you expect. So as I say, it's not about Rupert getting on the phone and saying, I don't like this, do something. It actually stems from something which would at first glance seem unrelated. Australia is very much at the bleeding edge of the Cold War that's developed between China and the West, because it's in our region. These concerns about China are theoretical if you're in the Netherlands or Canada, but not necessarily so much. You're in the same hemisphere and you have a very tight economic relationship as Australia does. And a lot of these concerns came out of national security imperatives. So a couple of years ago, Australia brought in another controversial law that attracted a lot of attention at the time. And that was applying a requirement on people who run communication networks or make communication devices to provide a decryption ability to law enforcement authorities in Australia. So if they thought there was a Chinese spy or an international drug criminal or something, they could say, okay, that communication is encrypted end to end. We don't care how you do it, but we have reason to believe this person's done X, Y, Z. Can you decrypt this and show us? And a lot of people say it can't be done, it's impossible, it's impossible. The Australian government, maybe to their credit, just said, well, we used to be able to do it, and then you encrypted everything, and now we feel that puts our national security under threat. So you better figure out a way of doing it, or we won't let you in. And funnily enough, one of the companies that was most resistant to this is Facebook. And the particular issue with Facebook in Australia is that with encrypted end-to-end communications, it's seen as being messenger is seen as being a favored means of communication for people involved in the child sex pornography industry. And there was a particular issue with the Australian government thinking Facebook has a very bad attitude on this. And that's where it all started. And the animus between the Australian government and Google and Facebook got worse. It reached its peak when, you might recall, there was a massacre in a mosque in Wellington a while ago. The fellow live streamed it on Facebook. Facebook received scores and scores of contemporary reports from people saying, hey, you're live streaming a massacre, you should shut this down. They resisted it until, I think, 29 minutes in, when the Christchurch police finally said to them, and found a phone number, which isn't as easy as you think to get in touch with someone at Facebook. Found a phone number, is here, you're live streaming a massacre. Can you please shut this down? Oh, and by the way, the dude's going on to another mosque now, so you don't want to be doing the second chapter. And when that happened, a lot of the political, and I'm talking bipartisan, government and opposition in both New Zealand and Australia, was so anti-Facebook. It's unbelievable. They really do think Facebook is up there with Al-Qaeda and ISIS and QAnon as threats to the body politic. They really do see.
So we said this on our chat.
That's how we got to this. That's how we got to this.
We were saying this on a chat with our social media expert a few episodes back, and it's weird that if you play a song with copyright, that gets pulled down immediately because there's an algorithm for that, whereas an ISIS beheading is often up for days. Yeah. And look, Facebook...
Very good point. And yeah, you're absolutely right. And I see some unbelievable stuff on Facebook and not just Facebook, Twitter as well. And it's amazing how quickly they can move when they want to. And of course they don't, because the most provocative stuff gets the engagement, which is what creates the dollars. And it's their business model to do this stuff.
Move fast and break things.
About it.
Yeah, their motto is move fast and break things. And unfortunately, the things they've broken are journalism.
So if you compare it to journalism, is it a problem that these big tech companies are relying on an algorithm to curate their content, right? Because if you look at previous journalism, this is peer reviewed in a kind of a way, like a newspaper writes one newspaper day. A lot of people can read this one newspaper day. They can check its contents. A media channel having just one or two TV channels, we can actually watch this content. One person can watch all this content and judge on its value. With Facebook and Google, it's just too much content for a group of people to completely absorb this and check if it's actually valid content or not. So we have to rely on algorithms, which I think is, for me, very much the big sort of divergence from previous journalism. I
think it's a fair point. And that's a point that's been raised here as part of the debate between the media companies and Facebook and Google. They point out that the content that the media companies point out that the content they create is professionally researched or edited if it's journalism. In other respects, it's subject to content classification regulations, that ensure things like an Australian equivalent of the old US fairness doctrine, for example, still applies here. So you have to present alternate points of view. If you there's even rules about you're not allowed to stereotype, and that there are. We have a regulator, a different regulator to the one I mentioned, the Australian Communications and Media Authority, that has an actively enforces these things, and it receives complaints from viewers and readers, and it evaluates them. Now, where the regulator doesn't have regulatory authority, there's an Australian Press Council, which has an independent chair, and it regularly finds fault with articles, and it makes them publish prominent corrections. And there are this whole regime has things like fines associated with it. And in extreme circumstances, a broadcaster, for example, could lose their license if they're repeated offenders. It's not unknown for that to happen here. So they say, look, we're subject to all sorts of controls, both formal and informal, over the quality of our content. Whereas Facebook and the others, get their users to generate the content. There's virtually zero moderation. There's even anonymity applying quite a lot of the time. Copyright is regularly breached. They get away with all sorts of things that we wouldn't be allowed to do. And it's not fair. Basically, it's fundamentally unfair, and it's reflected in what's happening in the market, where these two companies are getting 80% of the dollars.
Yeah, and they're able to cut all the costs and take all the revenue, right? It seems analogous
it's not sustainable.
It seems analogous to Uber, right? Like they're able to compete with taxis and be so much cheaper because they don't worry about things like pensions and holidays and workers' rights and, again, paying taxes. So that everyone's like, oh, look at this disruptive tech company. And you're like, its main edge is that it doesn't pay for all the things society demands every other company to pay for. And they've grown so big so quickly, like regulation hasn't caught up with them yet. That often seems the analogy in these tech giants. I think people are realizing that they present themselves as very so they're disrupting the industry, and you're like, not in a good way though.
Yeah, exactly. Just disruption. And of course, it's easy to forget. That we have a continuum of a couple of thousand years of Western civilization now. But the digital revolution is like 20 years old, if that. And it's only how disruption has become a cool word, because in most of history it was seen as a negative word. So and we have flipped a lot of things on their head. I'll go back to what I said at the start, which is the assumption that you should be able to link to anything and bear no costs for your behavior and the profits you make from that, which is actually fundamentally the argument that Tim Berners-Lee and Vint Cerf have made this week. Taking those old ideals of the internet from 20 years ago, they were both hauled out by Google to advance their case. Vint Cerf actually works for Google, by the way. I shouldn't say this. I'm on a private email thread with him, and I'm nice to him online. I come across as double-faced for saying it. But you can't say, oh, but what about my fundamental right to link to things for free and do what I want on the internet? Well, yeah. If you bring society down with you,
well, this is often the American rights, right?
Maybe we have to change those assumptions a little bit.
Yeah, but this is why I love the Australian perspective, because so often the American conversation becomes, but what about my freedom? And we're like, we're not talking about individual freedoms. We're talking about a huge corporation making trillions of dollars.
Well, and do you have individual freedom to share and link to everything free online? I mean, sure, it was the idea of the internet in the beginning. Yeah. We like to spread things and infringe on the copyrights. We've kind of come back on that a bit.
Well, that's the irony. I could get in trouble for something I posted on Facebook. Facebook probably wouldn't bear any of the responsibility for
it. Absolutely.
They enable it to happen millions of times a day.
If you read the TOC to Facebook, which I suspect very few of their billion users have, it actually assigns you liability for defamation or libel, and they have a disclaimer. It's very, very clear. You are, and also there's actually a legal precedent in Australia for a newspaper's Facebook page. The newspaper is responsible for defamatory comments in the comment thread and not Facebook, because it's like, well, it's your Facebook page. You should be curating and moderating it. Okay, fine. But it's Facebook making all the money. Okay. So
in effect, we are all unpaid contractors working for Facebook.
Yes, we are. And of course, the old adage, it's a cliche now, we're the product. If something's free, we're the product. That does come into it as well. I mean, that's another, maybe a story for another day. But in Australia, we're also developing a new law for what's called a consumer data right, where your data belongs to you and not to Facebook. And I tell you what, if Facebook's upset now, wait until one of the other laws that have been developed to hit them. So, I think that one's the killer.
The financial part seems to me to be the easiest to solve. It's just like you're saying, EU's sort of heading that direction as well. Individuals become their own right holder to their own content. I think if the internet eventually maybe decides to go towards a decentralized route, and your data can be called upon from, maybe it's an API connection from anywhere, but it's still stored centrally, your data, and we can trace it back to you. We can probably trace back the financial reward system as well to where the original content came from. But still, you have the issue of what Facebook did is it gave everyone an amplifier, right? It gave everyone a microphone. Yes. And then it's we're responsible for the microphone, but not for the person talking into the microphone. And this is also what made it hard for journalism, right? Because now suddenly we're not getting our news from just a handful of picked journalists who we have oversight on. Now we have 7 billion people that are their own journalists shouting information on the internet. But that's not going to go away, I think. And so how is Facebook ever going to become responsible for all those millions of users?
Well, I think there's two answers to that. One's sort of the practical and one's the theoretical, or one's the moral, might be a better way of putting it. The practical one is that we've already in the last 72 hours heard that Canada is a great fan of what Australia's done with the media bargaining code and wants to lift it lock, stock, and barrel and implement it in Canada. France has made moves in similar directions. But the Canadian, I don't know his exact title, I'm assuming media broadcasting minister, made a comment that I saw, I found very interesting about 48 hours before this podcast was recorded, saying that he understood there were 30 countries around the world looking to emulate Australia, and we're actually at the point of white papers or draft legislation, like not just maybe doing it, but are doing it. Now, so that's the first answer. Like, how do you change behavior? Well, if a lot of countries combine resources and share notes, and I know for a fact the ACCC here has been in very tight contact with equivalent regulators in Europe, North America, and developed Asia. They're all comparing notes on this, and they're going to suffer from a pincer movement. Absolutely, that's going to happen. So that's the kind of practical.
Business that is not regulated enough. I think that's quite.
So that's definitely happening. Yeah. But the other side of it, the moral side or the theoretical side, is quite simply like if you have a moderation task, the entity that has the resources should be the one to do it. That's sort of the way the world works, right? If I have a large family gathering, the family patriarch who makes all the money pays for the food. That's how it works in civilized, polite society, right? That's how it even works in developing societies. Poor people have patrons who look after their interests. That's sort of how the way the world works.
And if you're profiting off the system, then it's your responsibility.
Exactly. So that's the moral imperative. Facebook and Google and the other FANG companies, if you want to call them that, because Netflix, there's a debate over in the Netflix corner about what they're doing in content as well. If they're collecting all the bucks, well, then there are responsibilities, moral responsibilities that come about to keep systems going. And I think that will come more and more into play. It's a term I don't like, social license, because I don't think people who use it understand what it means. But there's a reputational thing here at risk for Google and Facebook. And one of the things about blocking all these news feeds in Australia the other day, a lot of these people are Facebook advertisers. They're customers of Facebook. They spend a lot of money with Facebook. Facebook did not apologize for what they did until a journalist managed to find a Singaporean executive on the phone and asked him the question, do you apologize to Australians? And given the convenient choice of saying yes or nothing, he said yes, but it didn't feel heartfelt, and he didn't proactively go out to say apologize. So they've actually pissed off, and Google as well on that, paying customers, and can't even be bothered to apologize. So it's actually not just the way they're behaving in a kind of mechanized general way. They actually sort of fail customer service and marketing 101. It shows you how they see the world, because there are very few other corporations that are so pathological that they would inconvenience their major customers and not say a nice word to them the next day. Yeah. Yeah. So that's the extraordinary thing about them, and we've seen there's a particular kind of modality of behavior and morality at work with these companies that maybe isn't the norm.
I see more and more though they're left with often only bad choices. So the big example, I advertise, tens of thousands of pounds a month now, right? And I was choosing between Google and Facebook as platforms because that was giving me the best bang for my buck. Sure. And for me, the big one was, Facebook was dragging its feet with the UN investigation into how it was involved with genocides and plural now, because you had both the Rohingya in Myanmar and then also Ethiopia.
Yeah.
And the data that up until a month before they were still selling to advertisers, when the investigation, right, from the UN asked for that same data, they were like, oh no, we have to protect that data. And I'm like, you were selling it a month ago. What are you talking about?
It's actually a very good point. Yeah, it's a very good point.
They've moved fast and broken so many things. They kind of only have bad choices now from a PR perspective. And it seems almost like the writing's on the wall. If you look at Do you remember the book that the neocons followed, which said you have to capture the Middle East? And sometimes there is this sort of like book written 20 years before the thing. It's just the template that these people are following, and it really gives you an insight. And there's a similar thing going here. Peter Thiel's book, I can't recommend it enough, literally says, if they'd have hired a bunch of lawyers at PayPal, they would have said, don't do it. It breaks this law, this law, this law, this law. So what they decided to do is borrow as much money as possible to get as quick as possible and make it as complex and hard to decipher as possible that governments didn't have time to regulate. And by the time they did, they were making billions in profit. So then they could afford the lawyers to fight it. And it's Facebook model is exactly the same. Like they just want to move so fast in so many territories and break so many things that now they're finally going to be held accountable. And some people are like, oh, but governments have been so slow to react. We're like, but they didn't have a choice. This thing was so new, right? Like, how is the average 70-year-old senator going to catch up with this and understand it and get ahead of it when it's moving and growing? Like,
it's actually funny you say that, because it's only really in recent years that social media has been influential in election results. And obviously,
and my has it, yes,
it is a great example. But politicians now have to understand social media because it totally impacts on their ability to keep their jobs. And I think that's only a really a past 4 or 5 year thing. And definitely it can be said that Australia is a country I know best, but the last Australian election was incredibly influenced by social media. The important thing to take out of that is that none of them like it. I think that's the thing. Politicians don't like other institutions having power over them. So a lot of this is about Rupert Murdoch versus Google and everything. Politicians here hate Rupert Murdoch as well for the same reason. They don't like anyone having power over them. And at least they can legislate a newspaper here, and that's been the big issue. Facebook and Google and the others are largely out of their control. But the specific thing that really annoys politicians outside of the United States about these social media companies is that they don't pay tax. It's really, really, really big deal killer for them.
Yeah, well, you don't get a vote if you don't pay tax. Seriously. No one cares, right? What you think if you're not helping society.
Yeah, exactly. So if I'm the Australian version of a chancellor, we call a treasurer. If I'm a treasurer and a company wants to come and meet me and says, look, I'm really important. I have 16 million users in Australia and I make $5 billion a year. And then he actually looks at the top corporate taxpayers and he finds you're not in the list. He's not very
queen. Yeah, you're at the bottom of the list.
Exactly. So I'm supposed to be worried about you for what reason? Yeah. And that's actually, I'm almost literally describing verbatim conversation that took place. So I'll leave it at that.
I wish the Forbes rich list just was based on how much tax they paid, and that was the only people we exalted. Because they say, I don't care if you inherited $1 billion and pay no tax by keeping it all offshore. Then you're no good to anyone. You're not a member of society, right?
One of the reasons in Australia the resources industry is so politically powerful here, and one of the reasons Australia is seen overseas as a kind of climate change denial country.
I did want to touch on that briefly as well, actually.
No, but I want to mention this because it's important to understand why Facebook and Google are having this happen to them in Australia. The resources industry pays a lot of tax here, and they pay more tax than most companies because they often also pay sort of additional mining royalties
and jobs,
state taxes, and create jobs in addition to the normal company taxes they pay. So because they are over average contributors to for our welfare state, for a start, they get listened to. And this is where fundamentally Facebook and Google misread the room here. They don't realize that there are big differences between your home country and other countries. So in America, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, I'm missing someone here, collectively have $8 trillion worth of market capitalization. Okay, so in a country where you have almost zero interest rates, a recessed economy, people dropping dead of COVID all over the place, if you've got 5 companies worth $8 trillion, you mess with them at your own peril. The funny thing is they are, though. There's antitrust investigations all over the place against Google and Facebook, but you mess with them at their own peril. But if you're a company, if you go to an overseas jurisdiction and basically you're avoiding tax, causing social mayhem and destroying civil institutions like public interest journalism, there's absolutely no reason for a politician to be kind to you. And I think as I said, Canada, there are other countries looking at this. I think there's been an epiphany amongst a lot of world governments that this is the case. And you will see, as I say, a pincer movement against these companies henceforth.
Good. I mean, I'm convinced they're horrible. Break them up, destroy them. But you did allude to an important point there. With great power, not only comes great responsibilities, but they have their fingers in a lot of pies. And I think you warned me about this in my research for this topic. So, I really have thoroughly had the case made that Facebook is an irredeemably evil organization and needs to be destroyed. But what happens? What are the knock-on effects if that happens?
Yeah. Look, I mean, I wouldn't go as far as that. I mean, but I'm sympathetic to people such as yourself, Chris, who feel that way. And because these companies have made lightning rods for their own back, and that this is the type of reaction they're engendering. So I wouldn't criticize you for having that response. But I think I'd like to make a distinction here, because Google and Facebook are not the same. They're very different companies. And Google, I don't want to kind of excuse them, but Google are a much bigger economic contributor than Facebook generally. It's worth remembering, and I'm going to go and have a look at that. I'll talk about Amazon and so on. Google, for example, are an enormous player in cloud, in data storage, in creating online business ecosystems that fundamentally help the economy go round. And they're not the number one company at it. Amazon is bigger than them. And there are lots of other companies in that space, like Microsoft and Oracle, and from China, Alibaba, and so on. But Google don't dominate that space. It's actually a very competitive space. So Google kind of play fair, play tough, don't make the rules when it comes to cloud. So they're an economic contributor in that respect. And of course, there's ancillaries of that, like the Google Apps ecosystem, which powers a lot of small businesses. And I'll admit, my small business is powered off Google Apps. I run all my email, my data storage. I do all my editing of my content in a Google platform. I'm very, very happy. It's very cost efficient. I don't feel like it's ripping my society apart, that aspect of what they do. I feel it's a wonderful, wonderful thing, and I'm a happy customer of theirs in that respect. But one of the interesting things about Google and some of these other companies, which is not appreciated, is how much they're paying for the infrastructure of communications these days. A lot of people would assume all those submarine cables that connect all the continents have been built by companies like AT&T or BT and their international equivalents. Well, that's partly the case, but definitely no longer the case. And in fact, basically these days, if you want to build a submarine cable, particularly an intercontinental one, you have to have a company like Google or Facebook or to a lesser extent Microsoft or Netflix. Actually, Netflix don't buy international capacity much, but those sorts of companies as your anchor tenant, as your main purchaser of a fiber pair or two. If they don't come on board with you, your cable will not get built, because these guys are now so powerful in the internet ecosystem. They generate so much of the traffic that they basically get to decide what gets built, what gets lit, what doesn't get lit. And they've become, now you can see that as a good or a bad thing, but fundamentally, it's their capital that is building the infrastructure that lets the internet run the way it does. So this is a really important thing to remember about these companies. Now, Facebook, maybe not so much, but Google would now be the number one buyer of bandwidth capacity in the world. So it's really important to understand the role they are playing.
I did not know that at all.
Yeah, absolutely. They are the number one. And then if you look at who are the others in that top 10 list, it's not telcos, it is tech companies. It's Amazon is a really big player. Yeah, AWS is another one. And then you've got the big Chinese companies like Tencent and so on are also enormous buyers of capacity. So there's a couple of telcos that play in that space, but only the really mega ones, the AT&T, NTT of Japan, are the only ones that, in their own right, coordinate enough demand that they have requirements for terabits.
Does that mean these big tech are starting to usurp the telecommunications companies, or is it just
they have a peaceful they have actually let me read it. They have an uneasy coexistence where when they think the doors are closed, they curse each other, but they're very, very nice to each other in public, is the best way of putting it. I hear it on both sides. So what are the, and this is an interesting dimension. This is something I wouldn't talk about too much here, because I'm getting into the realm of confidential state secrets. But what gets really interesting is when you have cables going to unusual destinations which have military or defense significance, but Facebook and Google also want to be there. So I'm going to talk a little bit in abstract because I'm about to break an Australian law about disclosing national secrets.
Exciting times.
Right. And if this is the last interview I ever do, I'm so glad to interview you guys. But you could theoretically, hypothetically, I'm not saying this is true, but it may be, have a situation where Facebook and Google and certain defense forces find they all want to go to the same places, and like maybe we should get in a room and talk to each other and build internet cables together. This is what becomes very interesting when you have one arm of government driving a Mack truck at Google and Facebook, and then another arm of government trying to cooperate and partner and work with them on building things. Now, I'm not saying any of that has happened, but it's very, very possible to imagine a scenario where it might have happened in certain locations, and particularly perhaps the straits around Southeast Asia and Northern Australia in recent months.
Right. And Edward Snowden made clear how complicit government was with a lot of things, and partly how Facebook have been given a free pass to get away with so many things was maybe because they'd cozied up to the military industrial complex at the right time, right?
Yeah, look, I'm not familiar with what Snowden said on that front. I wouldn't say it's been something that's been going on for a long time. I'd say it's a more recent thing. It's become exacerbated recently because effectively, and I don't know how much consciousness you guys have of this, but effectively it is now impossible to land an international submarine cable into Hong Kong. Like, you can't get the insurance. There's actually a US government prohibition on it too. If there's American money involved in the cable, you can't land in Hong Kong. You've got to go to Taiwan or the Philippines.
And there's very few companies now that won't have some American listings. So.
Yeah, but of course, all the American, the people who buy the bandwidth, as I just mentioned, are American companies. So this is sort of like a chicken and egg issue. But you can't land in Hong Kong. Now, there's another issue. You can't land in Singapore. It's a separate, very, very different issue. What it is that Singapore is a tiny little dot surrounded by the waters of Indonesia and Malaysia. And Indonesia and Malaysia have got what they call cabotage rules, where you've got to use local shipping to lay and repair cables or break live sheep or whatever it is. You've got to use local shipping. The problem is that Malaysia has one such ship and it's too small for modern cables. And Indonesia, I understand, has 0 ships at the moment and may have one in the future. So it's very difficult to get the, I guess, the surety.
Lay the infrastructure that Singapore would want with the infrastructure that Malaysia has.
So cables going in Singapore. So the funny thing about this is that Singapore and Hong Kong are where the telcos hub out of, right? That's their domain. And so what this in essence does is give Amazon, Google, and Facebook more power over things, because the traditional hubs basically have been unhubbed out of existence. And of course, the companies that have the greatest reasons to go and land in secondary markets, and what I mean by that is the Philippines or Indonesia, and go direct through a hub, are the people who have lots and lots of eyeballs. That's the American tech companies, Facebook and Google. So they're actually becoming more powerful in this space. And this is why they're starting to have conversations with people who wear military braid, which they might not have been having a couple of years ago.
So is this not also a problem with tech companies being apolitical and being a-nationalistic? So they can use their global power and economy to do across the world whatever they want. Countries still looking in their sort of more narrow political nationalistic views, and unable to cooperate on the same level?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, when you operate globally, you kind of don't really come from anywhere, do you? Yeah, and it's actually it's quite a good observation, because Google and Facebook actually, in a way, aren't American companies anymore. The bulk of their employees are not Americans. I mean, and Google in particular has a lot of employees in this part of the world. And some of the things they do, like Google Maps, for example, was actually developed from their Australian R&D unit. So they don't think like they're an American champion. That's absolutely true. The problem with that though, and this is not me theorizing, this is an observation based on talking to people who work in these companies and deal with these companies at a high level. The observation is that they actually are rather contemptuous of the idea that there's 189 countries in the world who will have regulatory and legal concerns that are legitimate and valid.
Yeah.
Because when you're worth $1 trillion or more, you are actually a top 20 economy in the world.
Yeah.
And I think
bigger than some of the countries you're having to deal with. And I can imagine for a Google engineer being like, sorry, we have to wait for Malaysian parliament to vote on what?
Well, it's actually really funny you say that, because that's actually one of the examples I had in mind, where you've got people who, there's a specific person, if you're watching this, I'm about to talk about you, and I apologize in advance because you're going to be offended. But I know he reads Comms Day, so let's see. If you're a guy who's employed by Google in Singapore as a submarine cable engineer, that's actually your qualification. And suddenly you're sent in to boss the Prime Minister of Malaysia around about his silly rule that's hurting your plan for a new cable. And that conversation happened. How do you think that goes down? Yeah, it goes down very, very, very badly. And these people who work for the OTT companies are so out of their depth in their stuff, but they think they're a player. It's like, yeah, I know better than the Prime Minister of Malaysia. They would, to a man and woman, think that. And it's an issue. It absolutely is an issue. You've got two different worlds colliding. At the moment, the law still applies though. so that's the interesting thing. And I think Facebook and Google in particular are about to have a collision in a big way with that reality. And if they handle it badly, they have a lot to lose, because that big share market value that I talked about, the $1 trillion value, is based entirely on sentiment. The GDP of Malaysia is not. It's based on palm oil and the real things they build and dig out of the ground. But that big share value in America is based on a perception that the value will be created from the unfettered right to do whatever you want around the world. And that's why the premium accrues to that stock.
Right.
And because that, after all, what is a share price but an expectation of future earnings?
Right.
So the fact that these guys have gone up 60% in market value in the last 18 months or so shows that investors in that company really do believe they have unfettered blue sky horizons to do whatever they want around the world. That's about to have a massive collision with reality, because, okay, I'll just use Australia as an example. If we don't get them with the news bargaining code, there's another law under development that you're not reading about over there. Our regulator here has done a big deep dive into the ad tech market, and they found that the ad tech market is rigged by Google. There's a Google presence at either end of the buyer and seller. It's like putting your man at the end of a blackjack table, trying to control the outcome. And that's what I mean, these things are slow, but that particular study is at its early stages. But that's what they're going to find, that Google has incredible dominance to create the rules of a market it's a player in.
Mm-hmm.
And when that manifests, and if that's legislated, that actually really is the death blow to Google. The power that creates their value is actually really based on that ad tech ecosystem. And if that gets dissembled, they've got a very, very big issue. So what Google has to do from now on is start to read the room. and sue for peace. Head off these laws, approach regulators proactively and say, we see we've been naughty boys and we deserve a little bit of a spanking.
Sorry.
Let's negotiate what we can do here. It could be a code of practice. It could be industry codes. It doesn't have to be law. And there are ways that Google can, if it plays its cards right and admits the problem,
it might have a seat at the table if it's quick enough. Yeah.
Exactly. Escape the punitive effects of draconian legislation, which probably in many cases will overreach too far in the other direction.
And I've said before, there is always a concern with draconian legislation that the big companies can afford compliance. It stops small startups from being able to. So it has to be handled very carefully, right?
Can I just make a point there? About the framing of what's just happened in Australia as lots of free money for Rupert Murdoch. And it's actually very far from the truth. Amongst the companies that have negotiated financial settlements with Google are the Australian edition of The Guardian, a company called Private Media, which publishes a green left publication called Crikey, the second biggest newspaper publisher and biggest TV broadcaster in Australia, which is called Nine Newspapers. Seven West Media, which controls all the TV and publishing industry in the western half of Australia. And another company called Australian Community Newspapers, which publishes all the daily newspapers in regional Australia. Now, none of those operations have anything to do with Murdoch. And they're all egging this on. And they've all reached settlements with Google in the past few days. They're all benefiting from it. The end result of this is that the jobs of journalists in non-Murdoch outfits have been guaranteed, and perhaps there'll even be more of them. That's actually the end result of this, that the non-Murdoch part of our publishing industry has been incredibly strengthened as a result of this. I want to get that message out because
too much of the focus is on Murdoch.
Yeah, and Google and Facebook are using this to frame this as illegitimate.
Yes, he's the perfect counterfoil. Yeah, right.
They're doing it deliberately. And I know that because there are people working for Google and Facebook who have tried to make that point to me. And it's like, guys, I can add up and I can see a lot of non-Murdoch people are making money from this.
Because I did start seeing a lot of stories on Facebook about Murdoch flying around the world in the weeks before that. He met with the British cabinet. He met with a few other people.
He did, yes. And look what he does in the UK. I mean, Murdoch has more dominance in UK newspapers. But,
and still owes us a lot of tax, I might add.
Yeah, but in Australia, he owns newspapers in the 4 or 5 biggest cities. I'm not saying he's not influential. He is, but he by no means has the only voice in this. That's just a point I want to impress.
I mean, he is a terrible, terrible person, right? I mean, we touched on it earlier. Is all the misinformation about climate change that his publications as well as others have pushed out.
I'll give you. One of the things I like about your podcast, guys, is that it's a longer format, so it allows us luxury to digress a little bit.
Yes,
I have my own podcast, and
forget it.
I run my own podcast. I'm only allowed to speak for a minute at a time on it. So,
you have the floor.
Yeah. Okay. One of the reasons Murdoch is centre right, and there's actually a specific reason he headed that way, and when I was a young journalist in Australia, I had a kind of middle-aged mentors who told me all the stories about this, who'd worked for Murdoch in the 60s and the 70s. And my own father worked for a competitor of Rupert Murdoch called Frank Packer, who owned one of the major newspapers in Sydney in the 1960s. And it was his last job before he passed away. The point I want to make is that this might shock people, but back in the 60s, Murdoch was left-wing. His newspapers were left-wing compared to the others, because the existing newspapers, like the one my father worked for, the Daily Telegraph, owned by Packer, and a whole other bunch of newspapers here owned by Fairfax, Sydney Morning Herald and the Melbourne Age and the Canberra Times and so on. They were very right-wing, in an old-fashioned, conservative, we love the Queen of England, and that kind, not new right type, like everything's a plot and the world's run by pedophiles. It wasn't that kind of stuff. It was old-fashioned 1960s conservatism, the Beatles, passing fad, that kind of stuff, right? So that kind of conservatism. So Murdoch pitched himself to a little bit of the left of that. And in fact, one of the funny things about Murdoch Also, he was, for example, in Australia, we're still a constitutional monarchy, and the Queen of the UK is our Queen as well. Murdoch was a Republican. His newspapers were arguing to get rid of the Queen back in the 60s. He was resolutely anti-establishment.
You're not earning him any more love from me, by the way, Graham.
and in those days, we had a very protected economy. We had a very protected economy, a lot of tariffs on imports and so on. And in those days, and this might be hard to believe, in those days, getting rid of tariffs was a left-wing thing because it was seen as opening your society and your economy up to the world, right? So kind of having the safe little protected economy was a right-wing belief, and that a lot of that came from the political power of farmers and so on. So Murdoch was on the left. So what changed? What changed was that he bought a lot of the newspapers he was competing against, which were right-wing. Don't change what's not broken. That was one thing. The second thing is, and like the UK, we have a very strong public broadcasting sector here, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which particularly in a country like Australia that's so big, it's very important outside of the big cities where there isn't much of a market for commercial media. So public broadcasting is really important here. And we also have a second public broadcaster called the Special Broadcasting Corporation, which targets content at non-Anglo-Saxon, non-Anglo-Celtic immigrants. So it does a lot of foreign language programming. It's effectively a multicultural broadcaster. So what happened was, as the 70s and the 80s progressed, Murdoch kind of looked at this marketplace and he saw that the public broadcasters actually were better at doing left-wing or centre-left or centre opinion and content than he was. So he tacked hard right, simply because that was the market available to him. The public broadcasters were never going to seriously hire a Rush Limbaugh type of person, right?
Yeah.
So that's why he went to the right. And I just want to make that point because it's sort of driven by some very specific circumstances that Murdoch ended up where he is.
We've talked about this before, Graham, a few years ago, where people always assume it's this sort of top-down plan of Rupert Murdoch going, how do I make the world more right-wing? But actually, like a lot of working-class people are traditionally have those values, and there isn't a lot of media, especially because it's traditionally university-educated, left-leaning people who want to write about their values and their culture. So, yeah, it might not be a big evil conspiracy.
One of the funny things about Australia, our right-wing party, which is in government here, is called the Liberal Party, which foreigners find very hard to understand. But it's kind of a little bit like the Tories, the modern Tories in the UK. It's more concerned with lower taxation than with cultural right-wing issues. Yeah. And the Labour Party here, the name actually tells you they're the party of organised labour. They've been influenced a little bit by the new left recently, the academic, intellectual, sort of civil service type left, but not overly. And one of the funny things about Australia is that our left-wing newspapers and left-wing press are, and I actually have the demographics and the circulation figures to back me up on this. Our left-wing newspapers and broadcasters are consumed almost entirely in the parts of Australia that vote Conservative. And our right-wing newspapers and content are consumed almost totally in the places that vote for the Labour Party. So what happened, the government here, the Liberal Party, the Conservatives, describe the ABC, the public broadcaster, as our enemy talking to our friends, is how they describe. So we have sort of weird mishmashes here. And I'm not sure how much that's the case in the UK or in Europe, but it's definitely a thing here. And it's a little bit like with The Sun in the UK. They've actually done studies on this. They found that even though The Sun is resolutely pro-Tory, even at its zenith of promoting Tory politics, 40% of their readers still vote Labour.
Well, but that's why it's often perceived in the UK as Rupert Murdoch trying to influence our politics by buying up all our newspapers, right?
Yeah, sure.
But isn't it crazy as well that we're having a discussion about Rupert Murdoch, left or right, but we can identify what Rupert Murdoch is and what his policy of his newspapers is. Can anyone here tell me if Facebook is left or right, if Google is left or right?
Similar to what we just outlined with Rupert Murdoch, I think they will blow with the wind, whichever's most profitable for them at any given moment.
I think that's definitely the case, Chris, for Twitter. You could see them blowing with the wind in the last election.
Yeah, at the 13th hour, right? After but horse had bolted, they finally had an opinion on Trump. Yeah.
No, but my point specific. I mean, the obvious one, it was blocking the link to the article about Hunter Biden, which, considering all the stuff they do allow, was very, very much an exception to the laissez-faire attitude they show to, under-credentialed news. We're not 100% sure about the sources on that one, so we're going to block it. Of course, it's 2 weeks out from an election, and they really, really wanted to be sweet. Because actually, funnily enough, even though it's Trump who had all the tirades against social media, if you actually look at the Congress and also the state legislatures and who's been mumbling or muttering the most about antitrust against some of these companies, it tends to be Democrats. So who don't care about things like high share prices and share bubbles. They'll happily prick a share bubble for the amusement of it. There's definitely to answer your question, they're not identifiably left or right wing, although they do have that kind of Californian tech libertarianism thing happening, which manifests itself in things like, I don't like paying tax.
I don't want regulations.
I don't want regulations, and I don't shut down live streams of massacres very, very quickly.
I just want to talk about the growing mistrust of media in general. It just comes up every time I have an argument with someone about, but did you get that source from the media? Did you? They're lying fake news press, and it really pollutes the discourse. Do you think the media has any burden of responsibility, like in the lack of trust that now has it? And what's the fix?
Yeah, I do, and it actually relates very much to what we were talking about before about Facebook in particular now having the resources to moderate content, but they don't because reflexively they never have, so they don't want to change what they do. I would say that it's a very, very good question, and I could spend an hour talking on this topic, but I'm going to distill it down to a couple of thoughts. I think the main thing is that when you're, from an economic point of view, a dying animal, you tend to act in desperate ways.
Yeah.
And that's why we see a lot of what we see with the media now. A very good example of that is the way cable television in America just trades in your confirmation bias. If you're Fox, it will tell you anything you want to hear about the evils of Democrats. Then
MSNBC, Orange Man bad, here's another story on it.
Yeah. It does the same in reverse. And CNN's popping around somewhere in the middle, kind of maybe hating on everyone. Who knows what they're doing there. So that's interesting. Now the interesting thing is, if you look at the same country, with very, very few exceptions, American newspapers are very centrist. Okay, and I'm not talking about a couple of big markets like New York, or you've got obviously the Post and the Times, epitomes of liberal and conservative thought, or even in a smaller way in Washington, with the Washington Post and the Washington Times have that same duality. But if you look at most American cities, they only support one newspaper. And by definition, they have to play it down the middle. And if you actually, I like looking at regional American newspapers, because I think you get a better feel for reality from them. And they do try very hard to be fair to both sides, because most people in America live in a tapestry of democracy. So there might be a Democratic president right now, but they probably have a Republican governor. And if they don't have a Republican governor, they might have a Republican mayor. And a newspaper cannot survive if it takes one side over the other. In those
most of these states, red will win by 2%, and then it's called a red state, and you're like, it's obviously a purple state.
The fact is, there are the local newspaper in a swing state, and we can name a few of them. Places like Nevada or Georgia or Florida, you cannot go rah rah rah, I love Trump in Southern Florida. 40% of the market might be with you, but you die if 60% don't like you. And I think that's one of the reasons in the UK you actually have such a polarized press, because England is small. It's a national newspaper market as a result, historically, because I can get it printed newspaper at 1 o'clock in the morning, and I can drive it to Land's End or to John O'Groats within 4 hours. So it's a national market, which means, again, I'm going to specialize. I'm going to go for a Lib Dem or a Tory or a Labor voter. Now, in Australia, outside of Sydney and Melbourne, we have the same thing, where none of the cities or towns are big enough to support 2 newspaper markets. So again, funnily enough, if you read some of the Murdoch newspapers outside of the big cities here, again, they're quite centrist. Shock horror. Some of them even have left-wing columnists. Seriously, they do. We have one of the other things about Rupert Murdoch here is that he runs a dedicated masthead website called news.com.au. It has no brand relationship to the newspapers. It's a dedicated pure play website aimed at young people. It's left-wing as well. It just broke a story last week about how the Conservative government here covered up a rape of one of its staffers by a fellow staffer for 2 years. They broke that story. It's a big, big, big political problem for the government here for the past week. In fact, in some ways, the Facebook thing has been very good at distracting from it. But that was broken by a Murdoch journalist. So a lot of I know the question is people trusting media. Funnily enough, a lot of the social license that newspapers and broadcasters have with their community is often based on the construct of the market. And that's the sort of the point I'm trying to make. And the bigger the market in terms of its size as a city or its concentration all of the internet, the ability to distribute widely, as is the case now, that's where you get your polarization. Because that wasn't the case back when the ability to drive it, how far you can drive a truck in an evening, dictated the nature of your market. And that's just an observation I want to make there. That it's important to think about how we got to this point, and those are some of the factors in play. But to answer your question more generally about trust, there's another issue. Journalists are increasingly being hired from a smaller and smaller social group.
Yeah, I think to get an intern, able to work for free for 6 months to get an internship at one of these big papers, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's a point that's been made in America, that New York Times hires almost exclusively from like 3 universities and from rich families. But I'll make a point more generally, and I'm guilty of this myself. I've employed quite a lot of journalists through my life, starting from for 25, 26 years. I've been hiring journalists for various things I've done. And I actually was making this point the other day about how clever I am, that I've identified this issue. There's so many arts graduates working as journalists. And I thought, hey, hold on a minute, Graham. Think about your own hiring practices over the last 25 years. I'm equally guilty with my own subliminal biases. I don't believe I've ever hired anyone without an arts degree. And I've hired largely from the same 3 or 4 universities. I even once hired a guy because he went to my high school. That's actually how pathetically shallow my biases are. But and I'm someone who sort of thinks about these things and questions these things. And I tell you what, when you're in the groupthink environment of a large media employer, with the culture imposes itself on every individual. New York Times is a fantastic example of an all-pervasive groupthink. What you hire the people who look and act like you. They come from the same schools and come from the same universities and read the same books. That's what happens. And I'm not talking about diversity in the sense of it needs to be more women or it needs to be more non-white people. I'm just talking about diversity of social experience. We need more people who've come from country towns. We need that kind of diversity, people who just come from different social stations in life. And that's how you get out of the groupthink. Because people challenge each other in newsrooms, then less bullshit makes it to air. That's a really important thing. And I've worked in newsrooms where everyone's in furious agreement with each other. And when that happens, that's when shit stuff goes out to air and you lose the confidence of your readers, because you need the Jiminy Cricket sitting on your shoulder saying, Graham, a lot of people don't agree with your assumptions about life. And that's the problem, as I see it. What do we do about it? It's a really, really hard, it's a hard problem to fix. It's easier to get Google to write a $20 million check.
Right, right. So what you're saying is you're missing media showing more both sides of the debate, because for me, what you're saying with the group bias, it still happens on Facebook. Like I'd rather believe what my friend says in 3 sentences than I believe what an article says.
Yeah.
And this is where people they don't trust, they trust their best friend who just posts a simple picture with a few lines, but they don't trust the whole article. I think it's as well, I fear that people just want easy answers and not any complicated articles anymore. I mean, it's much easier to spread virally and to meme one picture than it is to actually dive deeply into a subject and get to the bottom of it.
Everyone needs one contrarian in their social circle. That's my solution.
Unfortunately, I seem to have collated them all together. Just have all the contrarians.
But actually, if I could just say this, what you guys are doing here with this actual podcast is actually part of the solution to this. Yeah, because you're setting the whole concept of beyond binary thinking. You're saying we actually want to reframe the way a debate is conducted.
Not even a debate, it has to be deep dive enough to open up
and you've got a format allowing it, which is fantastic as well. Obviously one of the problems with the constraints of commercial broadcasting in particular is that it has to get every news story into a 45-second grab.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's a problem with Twitter.
Right.
Even more extreme, and there's no room for nuance or whatever.
Well, we have alternatives, right? I mean, there's podcast. One that I always like to mention is an outlet called The Journalist. It came from the Netherlands, now it's international, and their slogan is we don't do the news of the day, so we do slow news. We do news.
I've heard about that. That's a really interesting idea.
We've researched it, and it's open. It's community based as well. People give feedback, and they curate the content together. We have Bellingcat. We have so many websites nowadays that do actual quality journalism. They're not reliant either on the traditional spaces in which they need to do it, right? In order to distribute a newspaper costs a lot of money. In order to have a channel on a television costs quite a lot of capital to even get that one started, right? Yes. So, and the internet did give a lot of democratization, a lot of freedom to it. Unfortunately, in the channels which distribute this, like a Facebook, like a Google, we're not necessarily seeing the large crowds come together on these better platforms necessarily.
I think that's a fair point. I actually there's one particular thing I'd like to kind of tease out here as a good example of where things are heading, and I'm going to make a few assumptions in what I say here. I hope I don't offend anyone, but one of the things we've seen with Substack, the newsletter platform, is that it's attracted a lot of journalists of the left who've been, for want of a better term, kind of victims of the cancel culture of left groupthink in American media. And Glenn Greenwald, Andrew Sullivan, and Matt Taibbi, 3 very good examples of people who are using Substack. They're all the left that criticize the left, which means it's very hard for them to participate as, say, a New York Times columnist or New York, in the case of Sullivan, a New Yorker columnist, actually, with him. So now the right hasn't gone through that yet. Obviously, the right needs a reformation. The right-wing journalists at Fox News or whatever, not many people have dissented from that yet to sort of create a kind of sensible contrarian stream of right commentary. I believe it will happen. Though. I think it's inevitability.
As they recover from the hangover of the Trump fever pitch.
Look, religions usually have reformations, and that's all I need to say about what just happened with Trump. Yeah, sure. It's a religion that will have a reformation. Okay, so American conservatism will revamp. There's always been a very large intellectual, philosophical component to American conservatism, expressed often through particularly a lot of periodicals and so on, and the William Buckley's, the American Prospect, all that kind of area of stuff. That all got pushed away by Trump, and it just became celebrity TV, personified through the presidency for 4 years. That American conservatism needs to get back to that kind of thing. And that's actually what the left has got in America. And because you've got your silly aspects of the left as well, and they say and do crazy things, but you have those voices of moderation trying to pull them back to the center, saying, okay, you've gone a bit far here or whatever. And that for me is the future of journalism, where you'll never have a perfect media outlet, but you don't want to go so far as to have outlets that just preach confirmation bias. You need journalists who are contrarian against their own side, who make people think. A very good example of someone historically who fulfilled that function was Christopher Hitchens.
Yeah.
Okay, we need
and
more.
It is the most compelling argument, right? From someone like, look, I'm not against you. I see your point, but here's some of our biases like that we need to address. Absolutely.
And you need that on both sides. I mean, a very good example in the UK is Brendan O'Neill, who started off as an editor of Marxist magazines and sort of disliked what was happening with the New Left and sort of drifted across to the libertarian right. But he still has the kind of Marxist thing happening, a little bit like Johnny Rotten. That's sort of another example there. But Spiked is a good example of what I'm talking about, where it fulfills that kind of, it's not your typical right-wing outlet. It's got a little bit of an edge, a bit of a nuance to it. I think we need more of those types of voices, and they percolate their way up. That's the thing. And you look at TV chat shows and sort of quite high profile ones in America, the kind of comedy type Jon Stewart type shows. And they get on people like Andrew Sullivan and Glenn Greenwood and Matt Taibbi as guests so often. So these voices do percolate to the mainstream. And I think that's the kind of thing we should be looking for and encouraging. And whilst at the same time, quite rightfully, say if you're going to run 24/7 propaganda for a particular political party, then
you have to follow the rules, because we have rules for that, right? Lobbying, sponsoring political parties. You can do that through official channels, but just because it's a new medium doesn't mean you can flout all the rules.
But who's going to curate this, right? Because right now we're sort of leaving it up to market capitalization forces. What Facebook cares about is how many ads can we sell. It doesn't really matter the kind of content that drives upwards that will sell that. And it is users also spreading it themselves, right? You see this also on Reddit, also on Facebook. That's kind of a good thing. I like this article, so I'm spreading it. On the other hand, we're leaving it up to 7 billion people that don't know shit to spread the news that the other 7 billion people are reading. Whereas previously in the old style media, sure, market capitalization mattered. You still wanted to sell your advertisement, and maybe you program something that viewers will look at. But there were also programs that were created not necessarily for how many viewers are going to watch this, but we just find this important enough to put on TV, or we find this important enough to put into the newspaper. There is an editorial that can make that decisions that are not necessarily finance related or finance based. I'm not seeing that with Google and Facebook.
Yes. And I'm glad you brought us back on topic there, because it's actually kind of almost the key point of all of this discussion, which is that Google and Facebook actually have no interest in the society they're serving, or helping that society talk to itself about things that promote the interests of that society. They're
contrarian, right? That just
they're interested in the ego of the individual. Hey, how many likes did I get for the picture of my cat? They reward that kind of stuff.
So little point of nuance. Google's model is about building a network of trusted sources. Facebook model is, it's the guy at the bar who wants you to just talk to him for another hour. It just wants your attention as much as possible. So there's a little bit of a split there. Google.
What does that make TikTok then? Sorry, wrong question. It's a good point. I mean, Facebook in particular, but actually TikTok and Instagram are in the same bucket, are the absolute worst personifications of the short attention economy. This titillation, the short-term engagement. I've done it myself. I just flick through Facebook posts, literally giving a nanosecond.
It's fast food media
to individual bits of content. And it is addictive. Absolutely addictive. I spend a lot more time in my life on social media than I should by rights, and I'm aware of this. I know I'm an addict, so I feel sorry for those people who lack that self-awareness. What are they going to do? Right. But we haven't actually talked about this at all. But there's a similar phenomenon I see with the rise of video on demand and Netflix and Amazon Prime and all these platforms, and one of the things we're seeing is that they are consuming incredible amounts of attention, 4 or 5 hours a day, enormous things. Now, I'm not saying that the way people watch TV in the past was somehow glorious or life affirming or character building. But people used to actually do things like watch the 6 o'clock nightly news, and big percentages of the population did it. So there was like common reference points in terms of what's a fact and what's not a fact.
Water cooler moments.
And those TV news like ABC, CBS in America and our equivalents in Australia pitched at the mainstream. They wanted Mr. and Mrs. Middle Australia to be watching, no matter whether you lived in a Labor seat or a Conservative seat. They wanted you to watch, and they would get 30-40% of the audience. Now we're all watching B-grade straight to DVD movies on Netflix every night. I think in some ways that's almost worse than Facebook and Twitter. At least on Facebook and Twitter, the news gets discussed sometimes. But I would love to see data on this. The data is probably too soon because a lot of this is the last 18 months, 36 months that New On Demand's taken off so much. But I would love to see data on what we spend our attention on now. And I tell you what, I suspect B-grade American movies are at the center of their cultural influence as I speak, because there are hundreds and hundreds of millions of people watching one somewhere in the world tonight in a way they weren't before. And I would like to see more discussion on what that means as well. Like you have the dangers of political polarization. What happens when everyone totally disengages from it and spends all their time in not even in movie land, but in bad
might miss the arguments, right? When people actually had an opinion on things.
I know. I think, but I'm kind of making a serious point here, which is if you can conceive of a scenario where a big political scandal blows up, and because of what you guys have just identified, it's the issue of you've only got your own confirmation bias social group online, and then the fact that you actually don't watch any news yourself, you're watching Netflix or whatever all the time, you could be absolutely oblivious to a major scandal that has broken. And I've seen some sort of quite interesting statistics in Australia where once upon a time in Australia, 80 or 90% of the population would be able to tell you, unprompted, who the premier of their provincial state is and who the opposition leader is, and can probably name a few ministers. But I've seen findings in recent times where that unprompted recall rate has dropped from 80 or 90% to 10 or 20%. So we have compulsory voting in Australia at national level and at state level. We have 6 states and 2 territories in Australia. So you have a level of government that controls things like transport, health, education at state level. You actually have a scenario where it's quite probable that people are going in to compulsorily vote at these state elections and they don't even know the name of the leader.
Just
the majority of them don't know them. That's, to me, scary. So I think there's an overall issue with all of these things that are happening, which the technology is enabling. And it's not just about the discourse on social media, it's a broader issue as well.
That's slightly depressing, but very interesting point to end on, Graham.
Hey, I know we're nearly running out of time. I haven't even started yet. I'm getting.
I know we have to do another episode.
We talked about the time on straight.
Thank you so much. Is there anything you'd like to promote or shout out?
Oh no, I mean, I'm reveling in my relative anonymity here, to be more candid than I might be. But if you're interested in anything I've had to say, I run a subscription publication, and unless you work in the Australian telecom industry, you're going to think I'm far too expensive. So I'm sort of not worth following for people. But I just want to point out one thing. There's a book I wrote in the year 2001 about the .com crash, which was published in America, called Bandwidth Bubble Bust. You could probably still get it secondhand from disreputable Canadian paperback sellers. One thing I want to say was that I actually find what's happening now kind of uncannily similar to what I wrote about 20 years ago. And we have a major tech bubble right now. We've touched on some of this today. Some of that tech bubble is caused by the assumptions that these big tech companies have unfettered rights around the world and will never be regulated. But we know that's not the case, as we talked about today. The bubble's going to get pricked. And you only have to look at Bitcoin. I mean, Bitcoin itself, I think, $1 trillion value in the world, which is about just a little bit less than Spain's economy, GDP. That's Bitcoin.
Uses about the same electricity, yeah.
Yeah, the power required for Bitcoin mining is equivalent to the annual output of the power grid of Argentina, right? What is Bitcoin? What is it? Is it like a commodity like iron ore, coal, or something? Like, is it something with a tangible industrial output? No, it's not. It's
maths.
it is not a cryptocurrency, but a cryptoid currency, in my view. And it's another manifestation of this giant bubble that we're in. And the tech sector, the valuations placed on it, the way it conducts itself as businesses, it's just now way out of whack of reality.
Yeah, it's untethered from
reality.
It's
in a reality distortion field. Sure. And this, I kind of wrote a book about this 20 years ago. And back then, at least it was old-fashioned crime. WorldCom and Enron just got there through accounting fraud.
Okay. Good old-fashioned.
Okay, good old-fashioned bubble based on accounting fraud.
Good luck explaining the crimes being committed now. It takes 4 pages just to explain the levels of complexity.
You can't attribute the success of Bitcoin to accounting fraud. It is absolutely a religion, a blind faith. It's a pyramid scheme writ large. The people who started off with it make the most money.
But their point isn't most of the stock market that at this point, and they're not wrong.
Clearly, with tech stocks, absolutely. Yeah. And we're about to head for a big four, and I might be smiling on the outside, but I'm not on the inside, because I actually am desperately worried about what this means for people, because around the world, we have 0 interest rates, or next to nothing interest rates, very low bond rates. People aren't getting decent returns off basic retirement savings and so on. As a result, you've got all this speculative stuff happening in the stock market. As a cause and effect, and always is. So a lot of free money floating around. America increased its money supply by 40% last year. That's all money, free money sloshing around.
And there's very few levers for government to pull on anymore, right? There's
absolutely.
No more
They've actually fired the last shot, and that actually was it. Increased the money supply. So they fired the last shot. So we've got this. Then we've got COVID. Let's not deny it. COVID is Spanish flu and World War I all combined. That's the economic effect. It's analogous to what happened 100 years ago. So we've had COVID, but that's obviously just absolutely destroyed some sectors of the economy.
So right now we're in the roaring 20s heading into the Great Depression, right?
Or something like that. 1919, we're about there. But yeah, there is a risk of it. There is a risk of a depression. It won't feel like the last one, because our standards of living are much higher. And so there's more of a cushion for a lot of people. But in some parts of the world, that's not the case. And there are many people in many countries whose families are going to come out of poverty in the last generation or less, and they're going to slide back into poverty. And I really fear for them. And it's a very, very depressing scenario. I also think the other thing that we really have to worry about is the very tight just-in-time supply chains that the tech economy relies on. We've seen that with microprocessors. I mean, right now there's a shortage of graphics cards in the world. There's a shortage of cable modems for HFC broadband networks in the world. It's just be 6 months. Come back in 6 months, we might have some for you then. And if we have any issue in the Taiwan Straits, well, Taiwan accounts for 65% of microprocessor production in the world. And if there's any disruption to that supply chain, that will also trigger a worldwide economic crisis. So we are actually there's a lot, I come from a country that has a lot of bushfires. And we have bushfires typically when we've let the forests grow for 10 years and all the dead leaves come down, and it creates this bed of fuel, right? And all it takes is a lightning strike or an arsonist, and there's 8 or 9 years of eucalyptus leaves full of oil, and they just go up and the whole country goes up in flames. That's what it feels like to me right now with the tech economy. And the bad behavior of Google and Facebook is just one of the bad things happening out there. And I'm very, very worried about what's going to happen. And I wish there were more people in positions of influence and power who are worried about it as well. On that cheery note.
Wow.
But we all know that governments are famously slow when it comes to technology and technological integrations, right? It's
absolutely.
That's the case here in the Netherlands, at least. Like we just know the government is many years behind. They can't even make a secure website.
But the scary thing is, as Graham alluded to, by the time they catch up, all they'll do, and the only lever they'll pull is like, okay, let's prick this bubble then.
Well, this is the mixed feelings I have about what's happening in Australia right now. Are we having our Franz Ferdinand moment? That's actually Graham, what worries me.
We have to get you on for another episode. That was brilliant. There's far too much to unpack there. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
It was wonderful to have the chat. As I say, I think your format's terrific for being able to explore these types of issues. And I really do think that what you're doing is part of the solution.
Thank you, mate. Really appreciate it. Please send me any links you want us to put below. And thanks so much for being a brilliant guest. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Catch you soon. Take care, guys.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye, guys.